Hey YouTube, Alex here. This video is partially inspired by a conversation with my buddy Ron, who is a Filipino American who is planning to return here to the Philippines next year. And I just wanted to share some of what I gleaned from our conversation. Without further ado, let's go ahead and get into it. Why are some immigrants leaving America? I've made other videos distinguishing the difference between an immigrant and an expat. I'm not going to get into that in this video. It's beyond the scope of this video. But let's go ahead and get into it. The first reason is high cost of living coupled with major quality of life issues. There are a number of major quality of life issues in the United States. We could talk about the weather. We could talk about the, at times, aggressive and rude culture. In my experience, many immigrants come from a background where there's a certain kind of social etiquette to be observed. In the US, they're often finding that these have gone out the window. They're finding that people just don't really observe them, and the pace is such that you're constantly sprinting, you're constantly running from place to place. The pace keeps getting faster, the pace keeps getting faster, and that no matter what you do, it's insufficient, that it's not enough to try to be polite, it's not enough to try to be helpful, that people really have this kind of mean spirit, especially in the major cities. And a lot of us that come from immigrant backgrounds, that's not traditional for us. It's not traditional for us to be rude. It's not traditional for us to be overly aggressive. It's not traditional for us to operate in such ways. I know somebody will come in here and tell me about how their small town is awesome, how everybody's nice. That's great. That's great that you have that. If I'm an immigrant and I'm looking to work my way up the career ladder, I don't have the capacity to start a business for whatever reason, maybe it's beyond the scope of my interest at the time, then I want to go to a bigger city because that's where there are more businesses, there are colleges, that kind of thing. It's not practical for me to move to a small town where I may not have any extended family, where I may not know anybody, where I may not be able to get a job very easily. I've talked to friends from India. They have taught me about how hiring various services is much more affordable. And so if they've sold a business, if they've had career success, maybe their stock options took off, then they can go back home and live a much more comfortable life. They could build a house, they might be able to hire a private chef, they might be able to hire a driver. They could live a much more comfortable life than they could in the US on the same amount of money. They might be from a country with much more consistent social norms, where in such a way that they're accustomed to people being more respectful or considerate to each other, people being generally more friendly, people being more supportive in the group setting, and just generally easier to get along with. In the US, if you want to be treated well, you typically have to have tons of money. There are other countries where even a person with a moderate budget can still be treated pretty well. Some people love to drive. I'm not one of those people. I think of it as a major quality of life issue to have to drive everywhere. I like being able to go for a walk. And the immigrant may be going back to a country that's more pedestrian friendly, maybe to an area or a city where they can go out and walk to the local markets and pick up their groceries or whatever they need for the day. That's very uncommon in the US. Unless you're in a select few extraordinarily expensive cities, you're not going to have the ability to just walk around. There are plenty of immigrants who do come from places where there is street level activation, where you don't walk down the street and feel lonely and isolated like you do in much of the US. There's a perception that every single immigrant to the US is a refugee, and while that is the case for many, and it is very tragic, that's not the case for all. There are people that are coming from places that don't have the significant danger factor. Rather, they're coming because they've got a specialized skill set and they want to contribute and be rewarded handsomely for it. And then once they've collected their reward, it's time to go back home for some of them. The next point here is limited ties to the country. So for many of my immigrant friends, they don't have family in the US. They came for a master's degree and to work in the corporate world. They might be the only member of their family living in the United States. They may not have brother, sister, cousin, aunts, uncles, dad, mom, grandparents in the US. It may just be them. For some of them, they don't have these major family ties to the United States where, oh, okay, well, my siblings are here, so I'm going to be able to hang out with them. And even if they are, they could be spread around the country. I know a lot of people move for work these days, and one brother or sister might be living in New York, the other in LA or Miami or Seattle. These are massive distances. It's expensive to fly across the country. It's time consuming. And if you're in a demanding job, you may not be able to pull that off very easily. I remember having a conversation with a friend of mine's mom about not always getting along in the southern US, and she told me, you don't know how bad that sounds to a southerner like me, at which point I realized, yeah, I'm a southerner in that I grew up in the southern US, but I'm not culturally southern, and many of my friends in the South aren't culturally southern either. They moved there from Michigan, they moved there from New Hampshire, they moved there from California, they moved there from other parts of the country. If not them, their parent or grandparent was from some other part of the United States. That's an instance where, okay, I'm geographically, yes, I'm from the South, but I don't have any ties to any part of the country in the same way that some other Americans might feel, where it's like, okay, my parents are from here, my grandparents are from here, my great-grandparents are from here. In my case, my only European ancestor grew up in Idaho. And so, you know, I guess I have some extended family in Idaho. That's really it. The rest of my family, they're recent immigrants, so they don't have those deep roots that many other Americans have. And so I often feel like these days I have at least as much in common with my immigrant friends as I do with my American friends. And of course, this is getting into identity, and that's a tricky subject, but I just don't feel those strong connections to the US. It's not really a stretch for me to move halfway around the world in the same way that it might be for somebody that would be giving up a lot in terms of relationships, history, and tradition, and all of those things. The next point is that some immigrants get homesick. So some people do miss their home country. I know that my grandmother talked about it when she came to the US. She missed Japan all the time. She missed the culture, the food, the language, the nature. She deeply missed Japan. I didn't really get it until I went to Japan, and then after spending a month in Japan about 5 years ago, I realized, oh yeah, I could see why you missed this place. It's clean, everything is on time, there's very limited crime, it's beautiful, the nature is jaw-dropping, the country is just hyper-developed. It's a very efficient and convenient country to live in, much more so than when she left. She left after the Second World conflict, and so it was a much different place back then than it is today. Even the Japan of back then is a Japan she missed living in to some degree. I think a lot of immigrants feel this way. I've had numerous immigrant friends mention being homesick when we get into more of a vulnerable conversation about how they're feeling, and they miss the language, they miss the people, they miss not being perceived of as an outsider. Even I, being American, I still get regarded as a foreigner in some places. And a lot of people inevitably think about, because the pace of life in the US is so fast, when we do have some time to ourselves, we are remembering, man, I miss going for a walk by this beach, or I miss the hustle and bustle of my home city, or I miss being around friends and family. There's a lot of things that immigrants miss from back home. I've talked to many different immigrants in the US about their home countries, and it's inevitable that they give up something. I even have friends who came to America as refugees that miss their home country. You'd think a refugee, of all people, it might be a totally negative perception of their home country, but that's not always the case. Now, each individual has a different experience. Some will feel better than others, but it's worth consideration. It's worth pointing out. Some people do feel homesick. They miss back home. They miss the food. They miss the weather. They miss the culture. They miss something about it. And a lot of countries have improved. In the last few decades, a lot of countries have come a long way. They've developed, they've rebuilt, they've reconstructed, they've sorted out their issues. They've become better and better places to live. And there's this misperception, a lot of Americans who have never traveled outside of the country before, they think everything outside of the US is total Armageddon and is just terrible. And that's not the case. There are many places that have had issues throughout history, but Colombia is a great example. Had some major issues in the 90s. I went more recently in 2021. Had a great time. Love Colombia. Gorgeous country. Very warm and friendly people. very hospitable. It's not what it was. So it's actually come a long way. And so there are a lot of places where I think you'll see more and more people return home because these other countries are getting better. They've sorted out different challenges that they've been struggling with, and the future looks bright for them. The world is a dynamic and ever-changing place, and I think a lot of immigrants do miss their home country to varying degrees, and some will eventually return because they do feel homesick. Let me know down in the comments, by the way, if you're an immigrant thinking about going back to your home country. I don't know how much of this is just my thoughts, my experiences, or if maybe you share a similar sentiment. The next point, and this is especially true for the United States, but it also applies to Canada or Australia, the UK, is that the immigrants made their money. They worked in the high-tech field, they worked in medicine, maybe they worked in the legal field or finance, and they commanded a solid salary. Maybe they started a business, they sold the business, or they hired out people to help them to operate the business. They've got consistent cash flow, they own stakes in bigger companies, maybe they're collecting a pension from the government or military, that kind of thing, and they're far better off financially than when they came to that country. They've really gotten ahead, they've worked really hard, they pursued the American dream, and they rose up. They rose above a more modest background. I know that the US is a place with a lot of interesting and unique opportunities for a lot of people, but for some people, after they've achieved that, they want to go back home, or they want to go to some other country, right? They know that the US dollar has stronger purchasing power in other countries, maybe not their home country. Maybe they're not interested in going back to their home country, but they've got somewhere else in mind. And they know that after they've gotten that money, well, it's just a storage of credits and debits of time. That's what money is, credits and debits of time. So they've got all this stored up ability to purchase other people's time. And there's some other places they want to go. They might want to travel Europe, they might want to travel to other Western democracies, they might want to go back home. Once you've got the money, there's so much more flexibility in your life. You can buy plane tickets, you can pay for hotel rooms, you can try interesting foods you may have never been able to afford to try before. You're not necessarily in your working years anymore where you need to get ahead, you've actually gotten ahead. Then it may be time for them to enjoy their life. There's so many cool places in the world to go to, especially if you've got some money, you've made some money for yourself, for your life. You could go out and enjoy these places, places you only dreamed of as a young person before you got that money. So yeah, I mean, for me, I think that the best part of the United States is the ability to make money, the ability to start a business, to work in a high-paying career field, to invest. And once you've done that, I think for a lot of people, their priorities shift. Now, that's not everybody. There's plenty of people happily living wealthy in the United States. But some people, they see other places as being desirable for them. They see other countries, other cities, other continents as drawing their attention. And there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with spending your money how you made in the way that you want to spend it. Yeah, I mean, I think as people get wealthier, including immigrants, their horizons are broadened and expanded. Oh, wow, you know what? I never knew that was an option, but money gives you options. And so for those who have made it, they've got the option. Do I want to go back home to my home country and engage in charity work? Do I want to help family back home who's been struggling? Do I want to use my time to take care of a sick relative? You know, do I want to get involved in doing something else with my time that when I was working and I was struggling, I didn't have time for that. But now that I've got the money, I've got the time for it. I have the choice that I didn't have when I didn't have money. Considering that the US is going through some challenging circumstances, many immigrants have started to look back home. I have several friends in the US that are planning their move back home right now. They're doing their research, they're planting seeds. Maybe their parents even bought property 10, 20 years ago, anticipating such a move might occur. And so they're not going back because they didn't make it in the US. It's kind of the opposite, actually. A lot of them did really well in the US, and it's opened up a lot of doors of opportunity for them back home. They might have all kinds of unique opportunities that didn't exist before they went to the US. I've had the good fortune to meet a lot of successful people in my life, and many of them have told me time is more valuable to them than money. The time to spend how they want to spend it with loved ones, with friends, giving back, doing whatever it is that they want to do. And if they're in their working years, they just don't have that much time, but they get to a point where they've set themselves up well. They've got a lot more flexibility. They've got a lot more options. The United States has consistently produced wealthy people for centuries at this point. the unique combination of factors there makes it one of the best places in the world to build wealth. And so once you build that wealth, you get options and you think about what you want to do with your future. That wasn't possible without the economic engine in the United States. The next point is that they don't believe that the economic future of the U.S. is as bright as it has been historically. The U.S. has suffered from record inflation in recent years. Combine that with the struggling of the tech industry, with the heightened interest rates, and there's a lot of people that have been laid off, myself included. So there is concern about the economic future of the U.S. Is it going to be as prosperous in the future as it has been historically? I've talked to a number of immigrant friends, and there's a few things that come up consistently. One, the country's built. There aren't these massive infrastructure projects that used to happen when the railroads were constructed, when the interstate system was constructed, when airports were built. There are some, I'm not saying there aren't any, but there's a lot more red tape than there was in the past. You've got a lot more people that will object or raise red flags about big construction projects than 50, 100 years ago. Another concern that's come up is people saying, oh, well, it's not like the 70s, it's not like the 80s. The delta between housing, food, transportation, and your income is slimmer, especially if you don't work in medicine or high-end tech or say the legal field, some kind of really high value add field. Then if you're just like a working person, it's not as easy as it was to get ahead. It's not as easy to purchase a home in terms of the multiple of the median income, right? Look at the housing costs versus the multiple of the median income. That is not as favorable as it was in the past. So a lot of people are feeling like, well, it doesn't make any financial sense for me to own a home. And if I don't own a home, do I really want to start a family? And if I don't want to start a family, do I really have some strong tie here? You see this with the declining birth rates. I think that's another sign of people's concern for the economic future of the United States. A common refrain I hear, do I really want to bring a kid into a place that may have another recession or economic crisis every 10 years. I mean, we had one, the dot-com bubble in '01. We had the housing market bubble in '08. We had the pandemic in 2020. I suspect we'll have another one in 2030. I don't know what that is. I'm not a conspiracy-minded person, but it seems like every 10 years now, there's some kind of major crisis that really impacts people's ability to get ahead. And I think a lot of us are just kind of waiting for the other foot to drop in that way, like, oh, okay, who knows what it'll be in 5 or 10 years. I think the national debt is top of mind for a lot of people. There are many economic concerns that are facing young people. And for some of us, we want to go back either to our parents' home country or we want to go to the region that we're from. We want to go and see. I know I have some friends that are African American. They're doing testing and they're finding out, wow, my ancestors are from this country or that country, and I want to go see it. Maybe I even want to live there. With the advent of technology, many of our horizons have been broadened and expanded, and we're finding out that there's so many cool places to live in the world that may have a brighter economic future. I mean, the economy here in the Philippines is awesome. Like, it's growing rapidly. You see businesses being built all over the place. You see new housing projects being built all over the place. It reminds me of the United States in the 90s. That's where the Philippines seems to be right now. That's just my opinion. And I love to see it. I love to see people getting ahead. I love to see the optimism here. It's really infectious. It makes you excited for the future. Like, it's going to be a really bright future here. Yeah, I mean, you see like some really big time investors coming here because they have that confidence too. So not financial advice, but I think that the economic issues in the United States are really concerning to a lot of people. Young people can't afford to buy houses, can't afford to start families, and it makes it less compelling to stick around in a place where you can't hit these milestones that have been so common in the past. Many normal run-of-the-mill guys knew, okay, well, I may not ever be a tycoon, but I can have a kid. Well, that's off the table for a lot of people right now, or at least that's the perception. And so they're looking at other places that are more favorable. I think the Philippines is a very family-friendly country in many different ways, but it doesn't have to be the Philippines. You've got many cool options around the world. So we'll go ahead and wrap up here. Let me know what you think down in the comments below. Are you an immigrant? Are you coming from an immigrant background? Are you thinking about leaving the United States? I'd love to hear your input. It always helps to generate interesting discussion. Next, give us a thumbs up. It really helps with the YouTube algorithm. And finally, subscribe to the channel down below if you want to see more content like this, and we'll see you soon.